In the game of MediEvil, you play as a resurrected Sir Daniel Fortescue, a champion of the King of Gallowmere. 100 years before the events of the game, it was told that Sir Dan led the good armies of Gallowmere to victory over the undead army of the evil sorcerer, Zarok. Good was triumphant in the battle, Zarok was vanquished, and the hero Daniel succumbed to his wounds. However, this was all a cover-up. To save face in the eyes of the public, the King of Gallowmere fabricated this story. In reality, Zarok went into hiding, and his champion, Sir Daniel Fortescue, was the first warrior killed in battle, getting struck in the eye from the very first arrow fired. 100 years later, Zarok returned to Gallowmere, reawakening his undead army and stealing the souls of the living. However, as the spell is cast to raise his army, Zarok accidentally resurrects Sir Daniel Fortescue. Taking control of Sir Dan, we are given a second chance to fight back the evil forces of Zarok and redeem yourself as the hero of Gallowmere. And we will do so in record time. This is the tale of the speedrunning history of MediEvil Any%. Our story begins all the way back in 2006 on Speed Demo's archive. On the 27th of February, Adeshi made a post which detailed his split times, as well as a link to a video file which no longer exists today. In this post, Adeshi states the final time was 1 hour, 4 minutes and 10 seconds. Back in the day, Speed Demo's archive had a different standard for timing runs. Time spent on the overworld map screen and loading screens were not counted. Although we can't be 100% sure, it is likely that with modern timing methods, Adeshi's run would have come out to a time close to 1 hour and 10 minutes. Before I talk about the few things we can extrapolate from Adeshi's run, I want to talk a little about the layout of the game. There are 21 levels you can visit on the map of Gallowmere, and you begin here at the bottom in Dan's crypt. It is here that you can pick up a small sword, some throwing daggers, and a life bottle. The exit to the level is behind a locked gate which requires a rune to open. There aren't any enemies here, and the level is designed so the player can get accustomed to the controls. After leaving the crypt, you gain access to the second level of the game, the graveyard. Upon completing each level, you gain access to the next. When the 5th level, Return to the Graveyard, is beaten, you gain access to 2 different levels, the Enchanted Earth to the north, and Scarecrow Fields to the east. The final level in the game, Zarok's Lair, must be beaten in order to finish the game, and this level is located past the Enchanted Earth. The most straightforward path to this final stage would be to complete Return to the Graveyard, then the Enchanted Earth, and then progressing in a linear fashion from there. However, this is not possible, and that is because there are some key items we are missing in order to further our progress. If you decide to play the Enchanted Earth before playing the Sleeping Village, a level which is located just northeast of Scarecrow Fields, you'll realize that you cannot complete the level. About a third the way through, you are told that you need the Shadow artifact, and this item can only be obtained from the Sleeping Village. After completing the Enchanted Earth and a couple more levels, you'll come to the Crystal Caves, and this features a boss battle with a dragon. Interestingly, this boss doesn't need to be beaten in order to complete the Crystal Caves, and we can exit the level in the proper method. However, in the very next level, the Gallows Gauntlet, we hit a dead end. This level is unbeatable unless you can pass through this special archway known as the Dragon Gate. This wall of impenetrable fire cannot be passed through unless you are equipped with the Dragon Armor, and the Dragon Armor can only be attained by defeating the boss in the Crystal Caves. In order to begin the boss battle with the dragon, you need to have collected both dragon gems which are located in the 2 most eastern levels, inside the Asylum and the Pumpkin Serpent. So even in an Any% run, every single level must be beaten at some point, and we can see that's exactly what Adeshi had done. Adeshi's route also included 2 optional things. Firstly, after defeating the Guardians of the Graveyard at the end of Return to the Graveyard, you gain the Daring Dash ability, which can be used as a decent speed boost every couple of seconds, and can also be used to break down breakable walls. In Dan's crypt, there is a breakable wall which houses another life bottle. Adeshi backtracked to pick up this life bottle for one simple purpose. In this game, enemies later on deal insane amounts of damage, and you only get 3 or 4 frames of invulnerability after each hit. And secondly, every level in the game except for Dan's Crypt and Zarok's Lair has a chalice that can be collected, but only after most of the enemies have been killed. Inside the Asylum is the only level in the game which requires you to kill every single enemy in order to progress through the level, and the chalice is located in the final room for a quick pickup. If you complete a level with the chalice, you'll be sent to the Hall of Heroes. Each chalice you collect will allow you to get one reward from the Hall of Heroes, and the first reward you get is a rapid-fire crossbow. It is almost certainly intended by the developers that the player would collect a decent amount of chalices because frankly, some enemies later in the game deal so much damage and have so much health, you were just completely unequipped to deal with them. Adeshi picked up the chalice at the end of the Asylum to get the crossbow. While we don't know the reason for this, it is likely to have more ranged weapon ammo for the Demonettes, as he wouldn't have that many throwing daggers remaining following the battle with the Stained Glass Demon. For the next 2.5 years, there was minimal talk about improving the MediEvil speedrun. Ogre Slayer briefly revived the topic in mid-2007, but no run ever transpired, and in June of 2009, another player by the name of McBroiler expressed some interest. At the time, McBroiler was most definitely a casual player of MediEvil, outlining that he hadn't played the game in a while and wouldn't even be sure if he could take down the final boss with only the bare bones weaponry that would be available in the any % speedrun. He would definitely have to increase his skill and knowledge of the game in order to perform at a high enough level. Fortunately, there was one other person on the SDA forums willing to help him out: Grubo. Grubo's apparent knowledge of the game was astounding, detailing strategies for certain bosses and methods to perform some sequence breaks and skips in various levels. There weren't any videos posted, and each strategy he explained was only available in text. Unfortunately, it seemed McBroiler found himself out of his depth with any %. No speedrun transpired, and Grubo's knowledge would remain unused for now. After only a year or two, Adeshi's run was no longer downloadable, and there was nothing to go off of other than the level order that was used and a few tricks that were explained by Grubo. The people that were interested in seeing a speedrun of the game understood that an any % run would be difficult. It was clear that picking up a bunch of chalices to get stronger weapons would make the game easier, but it was not going to be fast. Adeshi's run seemed pretty decent, but with the video footage long gone, there was no longer any foundations to build off from it. MediEvil speedrunning was yet to take off, but in 2010, one person would begin a project that would light the spark that would jumpstart the community: Torn338. The project that was going to be undertaken was the creation of the very first tool-assisted speedrun of MediEvil. For those who don't know, a tool-assisted speedrun, or TAS, is a playthrough of a game that was performed with save states, RNG manipulation, and frame advance. This allows the creator to make a theoretical perfect playthrough that is far beyond what a human can achieve. Torn's goal wasn't to create a perfect run though. He just wanted to entertain people with some spectacular tricks and to build a speedrun community around one of his favourite childhood games. For over 2 years, Torn researched and tested techniques, tricks, and what the fastest route was going to be, and he eventually brought them to light on the TAS Videos website. With the TAS production being made public, it was quickly improved upon. Skychase, one of the users on TAS Videos, mentioned a glitch on the level The Lake. The end of the level isn't located very far from the start, but the gate at the end can only be opened with the star rune, which normally takes quite a while to collect. Instead, with some precision, you can clip out of bounds and still touch the trigger to end the level, saving over a minute. Things were already off to a good start for the TAS, but they were about to get a whole lot better, because another user on TAS Videos was about to get into contact with Torn, someone we've seen before: Grubo. We only saw a glimpse of his true power before, but thanks to Grubo, this TAS was going to get kicked into overdrive. He is responsible for no less than 12 significant time saves, many of which runners use today. Just to show a few, there is this clip to get the club early on Cemetery Hill, this partial clip which opens the gate from the wrong side on The Sleeping Village, and this tricky jump which can barely get the time rune without spending time to lower the vine on Pumpkin Gorge. Grubo's discoveries weren't limited to these quick parlor tricks. On Pools of the Ancient Dead, the normal way to complete the level is to collect 8 lost souls depicted by these helmets scattered throughout the level and bring them to the boatman. When this is done, a short cutscene plays and the level ends. Interestingly, the cutscene isn't the trigger for the end of the level. It ends when Dan enters this zone, which occurs off screen and is out of reach even with a perfect dash jump. To get around this, Grubo suggested using one of the fat armored zombies whose only attack is to try and push Dan into the marsh, causing instant death. We can push one of these zombies over to the area with the boatman, and with absolutely perfect timing, you can combine a dash jump with one of the zombies' push attacks, which will generate just enough speed to touch the level end trigger. And yet, none of these tricks were Grubo's biggest find. There were talks in the forum about a way to skip a significant portion of the Enchanted Earth. As Skychase mentioned, he made some sort of jump from the top of the bird's nest into the area which normally requires the shadow artifact to enter. What Grubo found was even better. He was going to skip 95% of this extremely long level, including the notorious battle with the Demonettes. In this game, there are 2 ways to pause the action. The first way is the most universal amongst video games, pressing the start button. The second way is by opening the inventory menu, which allows you to select different weapons and items you have collected. This method pauses most things on the screen, but the most important thing it doesn't pause is your character, Dan. In this state, you are unable to move, attack, take damage, or interact with any entities within the game, but you are still subject to the laws of physics, which means you will fall until you touch solid ground. Normally, you can't open the inventory whilst moving, but if you have it open, close it, and then reopen it again, you have a few frames where you can move just before it reopens. This is known as the inventory glitch, and it's the setup to perform possibly the most game-breaking glitch in the game, the level loop. When you fall off the edge of a level, Dan would be killed the moment he touches the death plane, and he will then be transported to the last piece of solid ground he was standing on. However, if you have the inventory open when you fall, Dan does not die when he touches the death plane, and he will keep falling indefinitely. However, as soon as the inventory is closed, the game will recognize that Dan is somewhere where he shouldn't be, so it kills him and then returns him to safe ground. For some reason, if you are holding a directional button and keep holding one whilst Dan is in this zone of death, the inventory can be closed safely, and Dan will keep descending into the abyss with a small amount of horizontal velocity in the direction you are holding. So what's the point of endlessly falling into the abyss? Well, to understand why, we need to talk about parallel universes. Here we have the full map of the Enchanted Earth, the level in which the level loop takes place. If Dan is here when he is riding the cable car and then falls through the death plane, where does he end up? Well, it turns out, down here is another copy of the Enchanted Earth, where we fall directly into the end of level trigger. This is distinctly different from Super Mario 64, where parallel universes contain no objects or entities. Parallel universes in MediEvil are just as real as their original counterpart. Level looping was not just isolated to Enchanted Earth. It was also used on Haunted Ruins to skip the annoying chicken feeding to lower the drawbridge. Haunted Ruins has a unique level end trigger via this catapult, so level looping directly to the end isn't possible. A third level loop on the ghost ship, which didn't even need the inventory glitch, as you could just jump over the edge and avoid the death plane altogether. And a fourth on the time device. It should be said that these last two actually perform more than one loop, just due to the sheer horizontal distance required to reach the end of the level. There was one other use for the inventory glitch which I'll get into a bit later, but in all honesty, we can all appreciate how far Grubo had pushed MediEvil before there was a TAS or even a speedrun community behind it. Thanks to Grubo, Torn was able to push the TAS time down to 43 minutes and 10 seconds. However, this TAS wasn't perfect. At the time, Torn was busy with school and didn't want to spend years ironing out all the tiny imperfections with the shoddy tools that existed at the time. That all being said, 4310 was the gold standard for a MediEvil speedrun. Over 2 years passed since the TAS's publication before we have videos of the first any percent runs. On October 3rd, 2013, Crash41596 completed a run with a time of 1 hour and 46 seconds. The run started out with decent completions of the first 6 levels, with the only trick that featured in the task to be this clip through the stone wall to collect the club early in Cemetery Hill, which is then needed immediately to gain access to the rooms beneath the hill to get the Witch Talisman. Crash decided to go north after the completion of Scarecrow Fields to go complete Enchanted Earth, Pools of the Ancient Dead, and the Lake. This was not the optimal route, as it meant he would have to backtrack on the overworld to go collect the Dragon Gems to the east later. However, this was with good reason. Enchanted Earth had the level loop which saved so much time, it was good to get this extremely difficult trick out of the way early. Pools of the Ancient Dead has you navigating around the narrow paths through the marsh to collect the 8 soul helmets. Unfortunately, the task route was just too precise to pull off, so Crash decided to play the level normally. Another huge reason to complete this level before travelling east is to pick up this life bottle, which makes the run far safer. This level didn't go without its hitches. An unlucky camera angle caused Dan to fall into the marsh, resulting in a 10-second time loss. There isn't much to say about the lake, as it was a very straightforward level, and it was completed because it was right there. However, the out of bounds to complete the level was changed to the left side of the gate, because it's possible to accidentally soft lock on the right hand side. Pumpkin Gorge was up next, and it didn't go particularly well for Crash. What the task makes look easy is no simple feat in this game. He struggled to get up onto the outer wall and got stuck within it, preventing him from retrying quickly. And the time rune skip didn't go well, as he jumped just slightly at the wrong angle and he had to painstakingly attack the tendrils to lower the rune. The Pumpkin Serpent is at the end of this sideline of levels, and it's rather simple. The exit is blocked until you defeat the giant pumpkin. To begin the boss battle, all 8 pods must be destroyed throughout this small level, and Crash does this extremely quickly with a club. After the boss battle was done, Crash activated the Witch Talisman at the Cauldron to collect one of the much needed Dragon Gems before exiting the level. The Sleeping Village began well for Crash, as he dashed his way through the level to collect the Landlord's Bust, which spawned Zarok's Boiler Guards, a necessary trigger to complete the level. Then, everything went bad. As he was trying to perform the partial clip to open the gate, he accidentally completely clipped through the wall into the out of bounds area. Luckily, there is a backup strat that allows you to clip back in bounds.
That's GG, I think.
He just clipped even further out of bounds. Luckily, someone in his Skype call mentioned that the run was not completely over, and with some fiddling, he could clip back into the previous out of bounds area and try again. This setback cost nearly 2 minutes, but Crash pressed on with his run. The Asylum grounds has you finding the answers to 4 riddles devised by Jack of the Green, whom resides near the start of the level. Upon solving each riddle, he opens up more of the level to you, and you must return to him before solving his next conundrum. On the second riddle, Crash must turn all 5 stone slabs so they show happy faces, but if the puzzle isn't solved quickly enough, a happy face will turn away, requiring a long and tedious reset. Some sloppy sword swings caused Crash to mess this up twice, costing 45 seconds. The rest of the level went well, although Crash did spend some time using a life fountain to rejuvenate up to 3 reserve life bottles in preparation for the next level, inside the Asylum. This level is the reason for why Crash went out of his way to get the extra life bottles in Dan's Crypt, Scarecrow Fields, and Pools of the Ancient Dead. This level is a 158 enemy gauntlet, with each one dealing between 40 and 60 damage per hit. For the most part, Crash played this level extremely safely, spending time away from enemies and charging up powered shots with the small sword. On the bottom floor, Crash avoids the one and only chalice he could get in the run, collects the second Dragon Gem, and exits the level. With both Dragon Gems, Crash blitzes his way through the Crystal Caves, takes care of the big bad dragon for the Dragon Armor, and makes his way to Gallows Gauntlet. With the Dragon Armor, he dashes through the Dragonfire Gate and steps on this button. This opens another gate holding a star rune, which he collects to access the end of the level. At the start of the Haunted Ruins, Crash plays it safe and decides that the level loop is simply not worth it, and takes a small time loss compared to the task route and decides to feed the chickens to lower the drawbridge. The rest of the level was standard, although he did take another death just after draining the oil to access the end of the level, costing another 10 seconds. Before playing the Ghost Ship, Crash creates a safety save because he is going to perform probably the most dangerous level loop in the run. If he doesn't land directly on the end of the level trigger and lands inbounds, the game will be soft locked, forcing him to quit all the way to the main menu where he will be able to access the save file. Unfortunately, this is exactly what happened, and he had to quit out and settle for a second try completion, a 90-second setback. Ghost Ship did have a level loop upgrade from the original TAS, as it was possible for humans to complete the level in a single loop rather than the double loop that featured in that TAS. Entrance Hall is pretty much a non-level at this point. There isn't any difficult platforming, and the enemies are rather weak, and it was over in just 45 seconds. The penultimate level, the Time Device, is a double level loop, just like in the TAS. Once again, Crash missed the level exit, so he took a death and hit it second try. Zarok's lair is split into 3 separate fights, the first of which is quite unique. Before doing anything, Crash takes the time to completely fill his life bottles. In the first battle, Zarok summons his 8 Phasgals to the arena, and these warriors cannot be damaged by any of your weaponry. In turn, Dan summons 8 soldiers from his Chalice of Souls, all of which are far weaker than Zarok's warriors. The only way to win is to use a unique weapon found in this level, the Good Lightning, which can heal your warriors in exchange for your own life. This battle is basically an auto-scroller, but it is the other major reason for the detours for the extra life bottles. By the end of the battle, Crash has used up 4 life bottles worth of health. The second battle against Lord Kardok is a complete joke. The Dragon Armor's fiery breath completely disintegrates his life bar the moment he brings down his barrier. The final battle against Zarok himself is only slightly more difficult. The Dragon Armor is even more effective here, completely melting away his life bar in the moments he is vulnerable to take damage. As a first run, it left a lot to be desired, as it was obvious that there were minutes that could be saved. In many areas, Crash played very safely, and he missed a few crucial tricks the first try and had to try again. Less than a week later, Crash would make those improvements. On top of cleaning up his execution, he would include a slew of new strategies. On return to the graveyard, he used this clip that featured in the TAS. After about 11 attempts, it starts to lose time compared to just getting the star rune, and Crash unfortunately managed to clip on his 19th attempt. Crash had also updated his level route. He wouldn't replay Dan's crypt to get the extra life bottle, and instead goes directly to Enchanted Earth to nail the level loop. Pools of the Ancient Dead was next, and this level had a small upgrade. After collecting this soul helmet, you get trapped here until you defeat all 10 enemies. Instead, Crash performed another level loop, which let him land just on the other side of the gate, avoiding the battle altogether and saving time. It was unknown whether a level loop could be performed from here to the end of the level, but it seemed that the end point was simply too far away, and just beneath the marsh is solid ground, preventing multiple loops. Crash's splits sync up with his old PB when he beats Pumpkin Gorge, and we see how much better this run already is, and that is despite a death lining up for the loop on Pools, a death in the cornfield on Scarecrow Fields, and another death because he fell in the Wheat Grinder. Although on this run, he did manage the fabled Time Rune skip. Just about everything in this run was of a higher caliber. More experience, knowledge, and more daring strategies allowed him to save time all over the place, and less time was spent healing since he had a better idea of how much health he would need in the future. Crash ultimately finished this run with a time of 54 minutes and 18 seconds, shaving off a massive 6.5 minutes. There were still improvements to be made, but Crash left the world record here and moved on to other games, leaving potential optimization for new runners. It would take over 9 months for the record to be lowered again. Many of the pioneers of medieval speedrunning couldn't quite top Crash's any percent time, and the next chapter of the history takes us to France, where 2 new people began learning the game, Cladall and Brescaz. Both Cladall and Brescaz began speedrunning MediEvil around the same time, but for very different reasons. Brescaz had set a strong time in the sequel MediEvil 2 and was waiting for someone else to beat it. Cladall, on the other hand, just wanted to speedrun a favourite childhood game. These new runners would be playing the game on emulator, which has a disadvantage compared to Crash's PlayStation 2 with fast disk speed. Load times on emulator were slightly slower on average. The exit from a level to the main map was about the same speed, but from the main map into a level was about a 1.5 second time difference for each load. Over the course of a run, this would result in about a 30-second deficit, but on the other hand, there was far greater time that could be saved. Cladall's initial approach was to go for consistent strategies, such as getting the rune on return to the graveyard, going around the Wheat Grinder instead of over it, and using the intended route on the first half of Pumpkin Gorge to avoid the tricky jumps to get on the outer walls. Rather than using daring tricks in execution, Cladall would actually save time over Crash on very simple things. The first boss of the game, the Stained Glass Demon, is only vulnerable when he is charging for an attack. Crash would end up beating the Stained Glass Demon as he was charging for the 4th attack. By simply timing his charged throwing daggers better, Cladall was able to cut out an entire cycle and save nearly 20 seconds. Another example of this is in the third room of Inside the Asylum. Crash would run around with the club trying to dodge and chase down the enemies to kill them. On the other hand, Cladall had a much calmer approach, letting the enemies come to him and allowing Dan's auto-targeting to point in the right direction, leading to extremely quick kills. Despite creating 5 safety saves during this run, Cladall hit every level loop first try. He took some sections a lot slower than Crash, going for safety over potential speed and a death. But don't get me wrong, Cladall was still abusing many of the glitches and clips, but he wasn't going overboard and would take the longer path if he felt the potential time save wasn't worth the risk. Ultimately, Cladall finished with a final time of 54 minutes and 9 seconds, beating Crash by less than 10 seconds and showing that MediEvil was still at a point where great risk was not needed for a new world record. Over the next couple of months, Cladall would devote time to practicing better movement and incorporating the more risky strategies that he avoided last time, particularly on Pumpkin Gorge. Despite all of this practice, on September 6, 2014, Cladall got on a run that was on pretty average pace. He missed the 3 cycle on the Stained Glass Demon, and then took a death just before the boss on the very next level, and he was almost 40 seconds behind. On Scarecrow Fields, Cladall would not detour for the extra life bottle and instead would try to complete the game with only 3. This was an extremely risky strategy considering the detour is only 12 seconds. This time save can easily snowball into an even larger time loss, as it was inevitable that he would have to spend time healing. But better knowledge of fast to get energy vials, which instantly heal 225 hit points, would help mitigate time spent healing such as these on Pumpkin Gorge. Speaking of Pumpkin Gorge, it did not go as well as he had hoped. He got stuck in the wall on the first out of bounds, losing a chunk of time, and the second out of bounds went even worse. After failing several times, he just gave up and used the intended route to complete this section of the level. At least in this run, he did get time rune skip, which he missed last time, and managed to save time overall. The 3 life bottle route would face its first test within the asylum. Cladall entered with his health at full, but by the end of the second room, he had lost 40% of his health. In room 3, some mistimed club smashes caused the fast zombies to swarm him, evaporating his life bar. Thankfully, as a life bottle is getting used, you have a few seconds of invulnerability. In room 4, Cladall had also decided to use the club to kill the straitjacket crazies. While the width of the small sword helps with hitting a lot of them at once, it is unable to one-shot them and pushes them far away. The club can one-shot them with a direct hit, and doesn't push them away if a direct hit is not made. When the club's durability got low, he switched back to the small sword to complete the level. Even though Cladall took so much damage and had to heal at the end, he still saved a massive amount of time. One thing that had irked Cladall was the need to feed the chickens at the start of Haunted Ruins, and the only alternative at the time was the level loop in the TAS, which barely saved any time. Just the day before this run, it was Brescaz who had come up with not 1, but 2 new level loops. It was now feasible to perform a level loop from the start and then land just in front of the throne room, and after opening the floodgates and defeating the stone golems, another level loop to get to the final area of the level to use the catapult. Both level loops combined for a 1-minute time save, but he also messed up both of them once each, saving only about 30 seconds. At this point in the run, he had only made 1 safety save, and from here on, Cladall would not make another. On Ghost Ship, he let out a sigh of relief as he hit the level loop first try.
Oh putain, il est passé.
And on the time device, he actually missed the double level loop, but he was able to regain his bearings with the visual cue of the train track and managed to hit the exit trigger on the next pass. And then came the final battle. All other runs at this point in history had a minimum of 4 life bottles, and 4 is just barely enough to keep your soldiers from dying. As Dan's health became tantalizingly low, Cladall ran over to the health fountain, taking his eyes off of the battle to heal. He had to do this not once, but twice, and his soldiers were on the brink of death just before defeating the last of the Phasgulls. Another neat thing about keeping your soldiers alive is that at the end of the battle, they turn into energy vials which can be used for quick healing during Kardok and Zarok. With his massive lead and getting a better Zarok fight, Cladall set a new time of 52 minutes and 36 seconds, cutting a minute and a half off of the world record. In the background, Brescaz had been rapidly improving and his PB sat at a respectable 57 minutes. Cladall knew that he would have some serious competition, and he knew that Brescaz was going to be capable of taking it down very soon. In a bid to make the world record as tough as possible, Cladall would get on the run of his life into the final battle.
What? Non, putain!
Cladall would finish this run with a final time of 50 minutes and 16 seconds. During the final battle, an unexpected pause occurred when his computer decided to try and perform a Windows update, which paused the emulator. Due to this, it seems like this run was never considered a new world record. But even if it was, it would only have stood for 4 days. Brescaz would have his own phenomenal run that just continued to get better and better. He used the 3 life bottle route and was able to maintain a good amount of health through Asylum Grounds and inside the Asylum, where he didn't have to spend time in the healing fountain at the end of each of those levels. There was even a new level loop in Time Device that had a similar setup but completes the level in a single loop rather than 2, cutting the time of the trick in half. There was only one thing that went poorly, and that was the second level loop in Haunted Ruins. He lost his bearings right at the end of the loop and took a death, and when the game respawned him, he immediately took another death as the camera was still panning over to his position, costing him a minute. To add on to this, if he didn't lose this 600 health, he wouldn't have had to spend time in the healing fountain at the end of Entrance Hall. The 3 life bottle route put Brescaz's run on the brink of death as he milked every last bit of Dan's health to give his soldiers life, barely pulling out the victory in Phase 1. And when he knew he was on the pace of his life, he begged Zarok to lower his shield so he could finish this run with a new world record.
Please, show me your weak points. Okay, good. Again, please. Oh my god, I'm gonna die. Zarok! For fuck's sake, Zarok, what are you doing? What? What? Yes! Yes!
50 minutes and 4 seconds. The run was now so close to the sub 50, and in truth, this barrier was absolutely beatable. The time was there on the table, right in front of the runners. They just needed to preserve their health in the necessary places. Just needed to perform the precise clips in as few tries as possible. Just needed to hit the level loops first try to avoid huge time losses. And then, it happened. On November 21st, 2014, Brescaz would finally break not only the sub 50, but the sub 49. In all honesty, this run almost never happened. Asylum Grounds is an extremely slow escort where you have to navigate a small mouse through a minefield of cats. The mouse decided to troll Brescaz by lagging behind, and then deciding to catch up right when a cat was in the way, resetting the puzzle. A 30-second setback. Pools of the Ancient Dead went terribly, with 3 deaths, leaving the run a hair width away from a reset. There was even a 4th death as he collided with an invisible wall right after the dragon fight. Perhaps the only thing that saved this run was the new mindset. There was no more room for safety strategies, no time to make safety saves, and no more time to leave on the table. All or nothing. The final time? 48:51. According to Brescaz,
sometimes this game makes me sick. All the fucking glitch, the worst glitch, are in the head of the game. All of them.
It was a rough experience. He was talking about the level loops in Haunted Ruins, Ghost Ship, and Time Device. All 3 had tiny margins of error, and if you fell beyond that margin, you lose a massive amount of time, or even worse, softlock and are unable to complete the run. It's hard to describe the difficulty of performing a level loop. On Enchanted Earth, if the camera is facing this way, Dan is here, and you want to loop to here, holding just right won't get you there. This is all because of the fancy camera system that was designed to choose the best camera angles, according to the game's manual. That means crazy stuff like this can happen. I can hold down from this point in the graveyard and make a 90-degree turn without changing direction and end up at the beginning of the level. Now imagine this smart camera trying to keep Dan in frame while you are somewhere not smart. like out of bounds. Not only that, he is out of bounds for a long time. You haven't even seen the full duration of a loop yet. Here, I'll show you. As you can see, there are almost no visual cues for the first half of the loop. You'll see Dan flicker, and then the screen is completely black again. The camera then appears beneath the exit as it rotates to Dan's new position and then gets stuck. It eventually pans away, and then magically appears at a completely different angle as Dan falls into the exit. While you are falling, there are bits of level geometry that extend upwards that prevent Dan from moving in certain directions. Because of that and the crazy camera movements, it's nearly impossible to travel in straight lines. Runners had to come up with sketchy counting setups in order to make the camera behave as predictably as possible, and thus be able to guide Dan's descent back to the required destination. And then you realise you have to perform 6 of these loops, most of which are at the end of the game. If you mess one up, that could be at best a 15-second time loss, 45 seconds if you mess up right at the end, or at worst, a soft lock, ending the run. On top of that, there were numerous other tricks that just ate up your time if you weren't able to move at the perfect angle. A run with near perfect execution was just completely out of reach for any human. Meet NoobKillerRoof. While Cladall and Brescaz had been practicing and setting their records, there was one other also practicing in the background. Less than 2 weeks after Brescaz's 48:51, NoobKillerRoof set a near unbelievable time of 47:26, a whole minute and a half faster. 5 days later, 46:33. Another 5 days, another 20 seconds slashed off. What the hell was going on? Up until now, no one had set more than 2 consecutive records, and NoobKiller, in the span of 10 days, had set 3 records, all way faster than his nearest competitors. There aren't any videos I can show you, but who cares? Because on the next day, NoobKiller just sets a 4th straight world record, and this one has video. Let's take a look. NoobKiller blitzes through Dan's crypt and the first half of the graveyard. There was a slight route update at the junction with the Angel. By stopping and hitting it 3 times, you can access the life bottle via the intended pathway, which actually ended up being a couple of seconds faster. Cemetery Hill is where things start cooking. Normally when you reach the top, a short cutscene plays where the gargoyles which hurl boulders at you during your ascent self-destruct. A new skip discovered by Crash allowed NoobKiller to perform a couple of precise jumps up the wall and avoid the cutscene trigger, saving about 5 seconds overall. The Stained Glass Demon boss battle saw a couple of new strategies. Firstly, NoobKiller stands really close to the boss in between the phases where he could deal damage. During this time, the demon can either choose to throw shards or jump to Dan's position. The jump is extremely slow and interrupts the countdown which starts the next damaging phase. By standing close to the demon, the jump is shorter and thus saving a tiny bit of time. The second upgrade was found by several runners independently. On the final hit of the fight, you can position yourself exactly where the boss would drop the skeleton key, which is the trigger for the end of the level. Normally, you have to watch a small cutscene of the demon shattering before you can pick up the key, but by standing on the spot where the key appears, it can be picked up during the cutscene, saving 5 seconds. So you might be thinking that NoobKiller was just executing a whole bunch of new tricks. Well, not quite. Take this jump onto the tombstone. Seems simple, right? Well, it turns out that these things are paper thin and not easy to jump on at all. Now, let's see how NoobKiller handles it. Yep, he just does it running at full speed, whereas everyone else would come to a complete stop, and even then it's not easy. NoobKiller's control of Dan was clearly a level or 2 above everyone else. And just to solidify that, when he goes for the Enchanted Earth level loop, NoobKiller was able to shorten it from 23 seconds down to 13 seconds in what is known as a half loop. All I can really say about this trick is that it requires extra precise positioning when reaching the bottom of the void. The exact mechanism that causes Dan to be transported back to the physical level isn't fully understood, and might as well be pure magic. Another important factor in the run is club management. When attacking with the club, each hit performed deducts 1 point from the durability, which includes enemies, objects, and the terrain. If you stand still and attack an enemy, you'll hit the enemy and the floor, each costing a point of durability. By jumping and attacking in mid-air, both Brescaz and NoobKiller could prevent the club from making contact with the ground, effectively doubling the durability. and as a bonus, it also prevented glancing blows. This allowed both runners to save the club for the enemies which could not be killed by one hit with the small sword. There was an ingenious new loop on Haunted Ruins where you could land from the start of the level to on top of the side exit of the throne room. This door is closed until you perform the loop which opens it from the inside. However, by landing on top, it was possible to carefully clip into the doorway and enter from the wrong side, collecting the crown a little faster than the intended route. But the biggest time save of all came in the final level. I mentioned before that there was one other major use for the inventory glitch, and it was also the reason why the top runners of this game play on emulator despite the slower load times. Soldier despawn. This is probably the weirdest and most complicated trick in the run, and despite also playing on emulator, never used by Cladall or Brescaz due to its precision despite the small time loss of messing it up. By opening the inventory whilst initiating the trigger that begins the cutscene with Zarok sending his soldiers into battle, they just kinda don't come out of their little dens. By closing the inventory just as Dan summons his warriors from the chalice, the glitch is complete. When the battle begins, all 8 of your soldiers spawn in, but only 4 of Zarok's. Not only does this glitch cause the battle to be 90 seconds faster, you never even need to heal your warriors, so NoobKiller doesn't even have to lift a finger. After that, NoobKiller just annihilates Kardok and Zarok as usual, and he finished this run demolishing yesterday's world record with a final time of 45 minutes and 7 seconds. So, about that soldier despawn, what makes it so complicated? Well, I'll try to sum it up. Firstly, having the inventory open as you trigger the cutscene is surprisingly difficult, much tougher than falling off a ledge with the inventory. If you mess this up, the soldiers spawn in normally, so the time loss would only be due to the time you took to set it up. Secondly, the trigger to spawn in the final 4 soldiers can still be activated. If you cross this red line on the battleground, or more specifically, if the camera moves too far into the northern region, then the other 4 soldiers spawn in. If you do this during the battle, you lose your 8-on-4 advantage. Essentially, the top half of the arena is out of bounds. However, if you never spawn the soldiers in, when the camera pans back to Zarok, it activates the trigger to spawn in the soldiers, and since the battle is over, the game freaks out and it crashes. So to prevent this, you can spawn in the final 4 soldiers right after the battle ends, and comically, they end up celebrating with your warriors. This prevents any nasty things from happening, and the entire area is now safe to play in. Strangely, soldier despawn only works on emulator. If any of the Phasgals are around after the battle on console, the game ends up crashing. Since soldier despawn saved more time than the load times on the PlayStation 2, emulator runs became the standard for running MediEvil. NoobKiller's 4507 might be the earliest of his world records that we can view, but it certainly wouldn't be his last. Whilst impressive, there was still massive room for improvement, as major time-saving tricks never all go perfectly, and it would take many more runs to iron them out. Nevertheless, NoobKiller set his sights on bringing the world record time into new territory. He wanted to beat the old TAS from 2011, the 4310. Despite all the advancements of newer routes and shorter level loops, it just wasn't quite possible yet, and we can see why. In that 4507, NoobKiller wasn't running against some previous run. He was running against his best ever times on each level, which came to a final time of 43 minutes and 34 seconds. That means if NoobKiller played his best he had ever played on each split, he would still be 24 seconds shy of the TAS. This wasn't going to stop him though. Just over 2 weeks later on December 30th, NoobKiller would lower the record again to 44 minutes and 36 seconds, once again with no surviving video. During this time, there was a new level loop being developed, one that had eluded the finest minds of the game, one that would save enough time to put the old TAS down for good. Of course, I'm talking about skipping Pools of the Ancient Dead. To completely skip Pools of the Ancient Dead using a level loop was seen as a near impossibility just a year prior, but thanks to NoobKillerRoof and another player by the name of Grimpill, it was now reality. You could begin the loop from the bottom right of this area and end up falling directly onto the end of level trigger. Because you land directly at the end, there was no longer a need to collect the 8 soul helmets or the red rune along the way, and thus, this tricky banana jump around the red rune gate was also implemented into the route. There was one major catch with this trick though. It was hard. Very hard. Much harder than any other loop in the game. What made it so difficult was the need to use the analog stick. It was impossible to perform with the D-pad. By using the analog stick, you get Dan into the running state, and thus also allowing the use of the daring dash to get maximum horizontal displacement. On top of this, the analog stick has much more freedom with which direction you move in. In this case, more freedom is actually a disadvantage, and to perform this loop, you need to perform 6 directional changes in order to travel in this general line. Because of the crazy camera when Dan is out of bounds, even a small difference in the angle held on the analog stick can cause wildly different results. But this was it. This was the trick that was going to help take down the TAS. One tricky jump and an incredibly inconsistent level loop that saved 50 seconds over the old route. On January 28, 2015, NoobKiller would lower the record again, having cleaned up a lot of his execution and nailing the new pools level loop. The time was a 43:27, less than 20 seconds away from the TAS. As fast as that run was, there were still plenty of things that stood out that needed improving, but it seemed like NoobKiller had a run worthy for direct split comparison. From here, he would stop running against his gold splits, and we will be able to see direct comparison to his previous run. And this particular run kept getting better and better, pulling out nearly a half-minute lead on the world record. All he had to do was defeat Zarok like he had done hundreds of times before, and he would have finally surpassed the TAS. Some bad luck and poor technique had just cost NoobKiller the sub 4310 as Zarok refused to lower his shield. When fighting Zarok, there is a bit of finesse involved. You need to maintain a good distance from him in order to increase the chance for him to stand up and lower his shield. If he is running around or off screen, then his shield will remain up. To add insult to injury, Zarok even went for his rare death ball attack, which guaranteed 10 straight seconds of immunity. This horrific fight ended without even a new personal best. We can only imagine how irate NoobKiller was when that run ended. But his day would come, as he was the only one with the skill to beat the TAS. And on March 23, 2015, NoobKiller would find himself with a run just as similar as the last.
Curse you, Sir Knight. I am finally defeated.
Nearly 2 months since his last world record, NoobKiller was finally able to overcome the TAS with a run that basically had it all. Solid execution all around with great movement, no unnecessary deaths, an epic close call on Ghost Ship that was inches away from soft locking and ending the run, and 5 new gold splits, allowing him to finish with a final time of 42 minutes and 48 seconds. So the big question now was if there were any more major time saves left in the run, or if it was going to come down to pure optimization of known strategies. There was a level loop developed by Torn and Brescaz independently that skipped the entirety of Crystal Caves, but since we needed the dragon armor, it was redundant. There was even another level loop from inside the Dragon's Den to the end of the level. However, it required a double loop, which ended up being slower than just traveling the normal route. And then there was the Holy Grail, Dragon Gate Skip, which could skip 6 entire levels, and this one had actually seen a bit of development. By getting wedged in between the gate, mummy, and the wall, it was possible to eventually clip through. It was extremely unreliable, and with both the mummy and the fire damaging you, you were on a time limit to get it before you ended up dying. However, even if you did manage to clip into the area, there was no known way to clip back out. There were a few other smaller clips developed by Crash that could be used, but the time save was pretty minimal compared to the potential time loss of having to try it over and over. There was even a fancy inventory glitch for the Cardok battle. Normally, Cardok begins the fight with his barrier up and you are unable to deal any damage, but with the inventory glitch, you could separate Cardok from the timer that governs his shield and attack him right away, saving 15 seconds. In fact, NoobKiller did go for this in his runs, but he had been unable to hit it in any of them. Asylum Grounds is the longest level in the run by a wide margin. As I mentioned before, you must solve 4 riddles by Jack of the Green, each progressively opening up more of the level. The amount of backtracking required to do this really adds up, but it's all necessary to access the next puzzle. After opening up the entire level, there is a 5th puzzle where you have to place coloured chess pieces onto their corresponding coloured squares before you can exit. The level seems to be unbreakable. There aren't any known clips to gain access to areas early, and there isn't anywhere to fall into the void, making level looping impossible. But what this level does have is low walls. A month after his previous world record, NoobKiller would finally figure out the way to get onto the maze walls. It was possible to barely get onto this unicorn's head by performing a precise jump from this broken pillar. From there, a series of tricky jumps need to be made over to the crossroads and then onto the maze. From here, you can make your way right over to the final area of the level and then jump back inbounds, solve the chess puzzle, and exit, saving 4.5 minutes. Once again, this was going to be another very difficult addition to the run. The first 6 jumps are pretty tricky because everything in this game is just thinner than it seems. But if you end up messing up any of them, you can start the trick over from the beginning. If you mess up anywhere after though, the run is dead, as you will either be out of bounds or locked in a part of the maze that hasn't been opened yet, effectively causing a soft lock. Either way, this was the next big thing for MediEvil speedrunning. As well executed as that 42:48 was, the new Asylum Ground skip could now bring the record to under 40 minutes. Hell, even sub 39 was now possible. Once again, NoobKiller's interest was to create another well-executed world record with the addition of Asylum Ground skip, and he would begin that process the very next day by bringing the record down to 40 minutes and 41 seconds, and then 39 minutes and 45 seconds just a few runs later. NoobKiller wasn't alone in finding new skips, as Brescaz would also find a new, albeit smaller skip himself. Early on in Scarecrow Fields, you'll come across a building that requires a moon rune, and a little bit further through the level, you'll come into an area that requires an earth rune and a battle with a mecha imp. After defeating the machine, it will drop the moon rune, where you'll backtrack, enter the building, pick up the earth rune, and then continue through the level. If you move at just the right angles, Brescaz found it was possible to clip into the door acquiring the moon rune and thus removing the slow battle, saving about 25 seconds. The list of grueling, precise and inconsistent tricks kept piling up for MediEvil any percent. A week after the discovery of Moon Rune Skip, on May 13th, 2015, NoobKiller would once again get on an amazing run, setting 4 more gold splits, and if everything went well, he would be able to get a sub 38-minute run. That was not meant to be though, as Ghost Ship would end that dream. One of the pirates got in the way, forcing NoobKiller to have to climb up to the crow's nest a second time. And then on the second try, he realized he was going to get a bad camera angle, making the level loop impossible, and was forced to take a death, costing him a little over 20 seconds in total. Although NoobKiller finished this run strong with a final time of 38 minutes and 30 seconds, this run wasn't quite as well polished as the 42:48 he had just 1.5 months prior. Every new addition to the run makes it that much harder to make a perfect product. Perhaps a few more runs would do the trick. And then, MediEvil Any% died. As mid-2015 rolled around, NoobKillerRoof stood at the top with the 38:30 as the world record. Brescaz, who still claimed the second position on the leaderboard, had recently switched to console and lowered his PB to a time of 47 minutes and 39 seconds, which meant that NoobKiller's world record run was an absurd 20% faster than the second placed run. At this point, most other runners had stopped running the game completely. Cladall says it was the ghost ship level loop that caused him to stop playing, as it didn't go well for him in live events, and because you only have bare bone weaponry, playing through the level normally is basically just a slower demise for the run. Brescaz attributes it to all the run ending tricks plagued throughout Any%, the list of which seemed like it would continue to grow, and that he would rather speedrun MediEvil 2. Crash had gotten sidetracked with Spyro: A Hero's Tale, one of the many other games he speedran, before taking a 4-year break from speedrunning altogether. There were a few other runners who had put up some respectable personal bests, but without an elite level of consistency, the many difficult run-ending tricks would prevent most from even snuffing sub 50-minute territory. With his world record basically untouchable by anyone else, NoobKiller would also stop running. Perhaps he had lost his motivation to play. He had no nearby rival, and it seemed that with all the other veteran runners moving away, he wouldn't have one in the near future. But we should all remember that before NoobKillerRoof was NoobKillerRoof, he was just like everyone else, a noob. With that, NoobKiller left the world record at 38 minutes and 30 seconds, waiting for any would-be challenger to rise up and claim it. By some miracle, this video does not end here. The MediEvil speedrunning community is almost completely dead. During the entirety of 2016, there wasn't a single Any% run submitted to the speedrun.com leaderboards. The only bit of action I could find was this race on Speedruns Live. Yeah, it was fair to say that this was a very casual race. In late 2017, it was announced that MediEvil would be getting a remake, and this sparked the interest of some new runners. However, they didn't stick around long, only posting a few PBs, the best of which was just enough to edge out second spot. Just before the remake was about to be released in late October of 2019, NoobKillerRoof returned, and he had seen that, unsurprisingly, no one had even come close to beating the 38:30. So, he would have to do it himself. NoobKiller wouldn't come back unarmed without any new strategies though. There was an upgrade to the half loop on Enchanted Earth, allowing for an earlier disembarkment, saving 3 seconds. A new pools level loop which allowed for the use of the D-pad, making it 3 times more consistent, and a clip out of bounds on Scarecrow Fields, taking a shorter path to the end of the level. On October 23rd, 2019, NoobKiller would break his own world record again. The start of this run was absolutely incredible, beginning with a quick clip here and a 1-cycle fight on the Guardians of the Graveyard. A near perfect Scarecrow Fields, pulling out a sizable lead, and then a perfect Asylum ground skip, giving him a lead of over 45 seconds. A couple of club misses in room 3 of the Asylum caused NoobKiller to drop 20 seconds, just showing how punishing even non-run ending tricks can be. The lead would slowly dwindle in comparison to the strong world record, but after hitting this daring ghost ship loop without any hiccups, the lead was extended back out to nearly 40 seconds. To finish off this run, NoobKiller would have an unbelievably good Zarok fight, where he would save another massive 22 seconds, cutting a near untouchable world record by another minute, down to 37 minutes and 27 seconds. And once again, the world record had reached the incredible caliber of the 42:48. NoobKiller had set a precedent. Whether he had competition or not, he was still at the top of MediEvil Any%, and he wasn't going to walk away and let his world record be taken easily. In late January of 2020, a Discord server was finally created for the speedrunning of MediEvil. Interest was once again growing, attracting new and old runners back to this classic game. Crash would unveil that he had interest in creating a new tool-assisted speedrun, claiming that he could bring the theoretical time down to below 30 minutes. But for that to be possible, Dragon Gate Skip would need to be real. Dragon Gate Skip was the holy grail for MediEvil any %, and it was akin to Gulp Skip from Spyro 2, or Barrier Skip in The Legend of Zelda The Wind Waker HD. Nearly every runner, tasser, and glitch hunter involved with MediEvil had scoured every corner of the Gallows Gauntlet in hopes that they could find a way to the exit without the need of the dragon armor. One thing that had been realized was that the entirety of the gate was not solid. There was a small hole in this corner, and we could gain a little bit of height using the slope behind the gate. But the slope is rather shallow, and the distance you needed to jump was just too far with the amount of speed that you could attain. What was actually needed to be done to complete the level was to get past this gate, which required a star rune, but as you can see, there is this wide open space above it. All that is needed is a bit of height to go over. Before the first task was made, Grubo had noticed that there was a wooden stake high on the wall, and there was this short pillar. From the pillar, you could jump onto the stake, and then over to the level exit. No matter how hard Grubo tried and Torn's extensive tassing, they were unable to find a legitimate way onto the initial pillar, and we can only really show it off using cheats and the camera 8 trick, which was used by the developers to playtest the game. Grubo's other idea was to somehow pick up the yellow rune through the gate. After all, this level did seem to have an abundance of spots where a player could clip into or through objects, and even some of the gates. After several hundred hours, this search ended in failure, as Grubo and Torn were unable to find a workable clip, and even Crash went searching, come out with some wild methods and jumps, but the gate holding that rune seemed to be rock solid. The list of ideas goes on and on. Glitch hunter Bobby Kays says he was able to ride up the seam of this wall with the stakes with the help of some in-game lag. However, it has never been replicated since. Other ideas floated around about duplicating one of the dragon gems, making only one of the dragon gems required. Those ideas ended in failure. Probably the craziest idea came from Crash, and it was to use the enemy dragon which is in the chest at the back of the room to boost Dan up to the gap to escape. The dragon is able to interact with Dan a little, and can even travel upwards. However, it seems like this interaction lasts only for a frame or two, and even at the TAS level, manipulating the dragon's movement was almost impossible. And yes, it wasn't possible to use the dragon to get onto the short pillar either. On an old thread on TAS videos, Crash came across a post from Grubo describing a movement technique that never actually featured in the original tool-assisted speedrun due to Torn's time constraints. The club is a bit of a special weapon in the sense that its alternate fire is to simply extend it outwards. This doesn't do any damage to enemies, but it does make contact with walls, and there is a pushback. It was known that this knockback could also be combined with a dash and a change in direction exactly 2 frames later. Essentially, this move called a knockback dash can give a very temporary boost in speed whilst also performing a 180-degree turn. Torn and Grubo used this technique all over Gallows Gauntlet in attempts to get to areas that were not possible otherwise, including aiming for that hole at the top of the Dragon Gate. Back in 2010, a young Torn did not have the luxury of modern tassing tools and was using his dad's laptop, and this is probably why this was never found. Because on the 20th of July 2020, Crash broke MediEvil in half by finding Dragon Gate Skip using the knockback dash technique. This skip could have easily been discovered 10 years prior, but now it was finally here. After Crash's revolutionary find, Scarecrow Fields, Pumpkin Gorge, Pumpkin Serpent, Sleeping Village, Asylum Grounds, and the Asylum no longer needed to be played. In addition to this, the Witch Talisman was no longer required from Cemetery Hill, and Crystal Caves could now be level looped since the Dragon Armor was no longer attainable, saving even more time. Overall, Dragon Gate Skip would save a whopping 15 minutes off of the any % run. Due to this, there was a category split to preserve the older runs which played these 6 levels, and became designated as any % no DGS. Even though DGS removed over half a dozen difficult tricks from the 6 eastern levels, including the notorious Asylum Ground skip, the consensus was that completing an any % run was now even more difficult. With practice, performing a knockback dash to escape the room would become more consistent. However, clipping into the room with the mummy was ridiculously inconsistent, leading many runs to their fiery death just outside the gate. As you might have guessed, NoobKiller would be the first to begin going for the new any% route, spending nearly a month practicing DGS. There was a nice setup he found, as there was an invisible wall you could get caught on if you ran at the correct angle, and this helped him build consistency with the inputs required to escape the room. On August 24th, 2020, NoobKiller was able to complete the first ever run using Dragon Gate Skip, and it wasn't world record. He had a 9.5 minute lead into the final level, but ended up losing 11 minutes. What had happened was that his club broke. All past runs have used the Dragon Armor to kill Kardok and Zarok, to great effect. However, since the Dragon Armor is no longer acquired, the club is by far the next best weapon. There was no need to pick up the small sword in Dan's crypt, and all NoobKiller was left with was some throwing daggers and his arm. Every failed knockback dash to perform DGS results in a deduction to the durability. Furthermore, there are 4 enemies right in the spot where you need to perform the knockback dash, and they are often in the way and need to be killed, and the fastest way is to use the club, depleting it even more. Since the Witch Talisman was no longer required, the club was picked up in Hilltop Mausoleum, and this was the only club in the route. If you used it too much, your run was doomed to have an extremely slow final split. Around the same time Dragon Gate Skip was found, there was yet another movement technique added into the run. Torn had found that in MediEvil 2, if you repeatedly input movement in the same direction as you were running, you could gain absurd amounts of speed, far greater than what is humanly controllable. Tassa Derp Princess would rediscover this glitch in the original MediEvil, but its effects were not as exaggerated. If done perfectly, the gain in speed would equal Dan's walking speed plus his running speed, which totaled up to about a 40% increase. This was useful up until you gained the Daring Dash ability. At this point, NoobKiller had set more than 12 records in a row, and that streak was not about to end. He would add in even more improvements, upgrading both level loops on Haunted Ruins. Years prior, Luke RF44 found a crazy half level loop into a warp point, saving nearly 20 seconds. This trick was so inconsistent and unexplainable, it was possible for runners to get it before accidentally, although they never did. NoobKiller and another runner, Lalle, found a decently consistent setup that required just a normal run from the start of the level to the drawbridge, and then mash triangle for 9 dashes, and hope for the best whilst falling. The second loop began at the Golem battle with another precise setup requiring 2 stutters at the edge of the level. The endpoint for the loop was at the catapult area, although it was quite likely you would not make it and end up on the mountainside, where you would have to carefully navigate your way back down. Over the course of the next 6 months, NoobKiller would grind any% again, bringing the world record down as low as he could get it. The record now stood at 23:40. As quick as NoobKiller had returned, he disappeared once again. He had faced absolutely no competition during this time, being the only person to even submit times to the new any% leaderboard. There were a few other runners playing, but they had flocked to the longer, more friendlier categories with a shallower learning curve. Over the course of the next year, only a single runner, Warbrother, would post an any% time, a 26:47. Crash said he had learned the game quicker and more efficiently than anyone he had ever seen over the years, but he too faded from the MediEvil community. As the end of 2021 arrived, any% finally saw some new competition from 3 runners. JacoboTheChocobo was a very skilled player, however, he would be the only person to grind any% on console, and thus, it would be nearly impossible for him to compete with the emulator runners, as he could not perform Soldier Despawn. Nazzareno had begun playing any% no DGS in mid-2020, and over the course of a year and a half, grinded the time down and eventually surpassed NoobKiller's 37:27 with a 36:32, proving his own skill at the game, with some assistance of some godlike luck on the Zarok split. The third runner, Londanomala, was the last to arrive, having watched Naz since the end of 2020 and only finally picking up the game after Dragon Gate skip was found, with reasons that might question one's sanity. All three would be up against NoobKiller, the person who had set more than 20 records in a row and held the #1 spot for the last 7.5 years. Typically, as a world record time gets lower, it becomes more and more difficult to lower it further, as you now have to execute better, use more difficult strategies, or just get luckier. That isn't what happened for the next world record. Big revolution was coming to MediEvil. Runners were becoming more and more consistent with the knockback dash to complete the Dragon Gate skip. However, getting into the gate was another story. Using the mummy was incredibly slow and inconsistent, requiring levels of precision outside of the player's control. Crash had been tassing another method to get in, using a knockback dash from one corner to the other. The advantage of this was the greater speed that could be achieved. However, the angle Dan travels in was so shallow, it was difficult to say whether humans could do it. Jacobo grinded this trick out and found that humans could get far more consistent at this in comparison with using the mummy. Jacobo had turned a major run killer into something much more friendly to runners consistent with the knockback dash. And just a few days later, he would hit the jackpot again with another major run killer, Pools of the Ancient Dead. The Pools of the Ancient Dead level loop was still seen as one of the most difficult and frustrating tricks in the entire run, requiring several blind and precise directional changes, all to skip the large fetch quest this level entails. In truth, as difficult as it is, it doesn't skip 100% of the level like Crystal Caves or the Time Device level loops, which were much simpler, since you have to run all the way to the back of the level to get to the area where you can fall through the death plane. One interesting thing about the intended way to exit the level is that when you hand over the lost souls to the boatman, you always give all the ones you have collected, meaning if you wanted to, you could hand them over one at a time. This doesn't really do much on its own, as the boatman tells Dan that he can't leave until he has all 8. Jacobo had been messing around with the effects of equipping or using an item with the inventory glitch whilst you have taken a death in the ooze, and he was able to get some odd effects, such as getting Dan resurrected with 0 health and also soft locking the game. Jacobo then thought about performing the inventory glitch whilst next to the boatman, selecting a single lost soul helmet he had collected. This interrupts Dan's slow resurrection and puts him in a levitating state, and amazingly, restores controls back to the player. Jacobo messed around, perhaps not quite yet realizing the magnitude of this discovery. Eventually, he floats Dan's dead corpse over to the end of the level trigger, and then he realized what he had just done. The new skip, now known as Jaco Ghost, was quite a bit faster than the Pools level loop, but more importantly, it was 100 times easier. The only downside to this strategy was that there was no way it was going to be viable to collect that third life bottle, meaning even greater care was going to need to be taken on the Zarok fight. Along with the mummyless Dragon Gate skip, Nazzareno proclaimed that the world record was now absolutely free for the taking, but not before another thing was going to be added to the run. The Stained Glass Demon is a terribly slow fight, and you must use ranged weaponry to damage it. The only ranged weapons you have at this point are your arm, which sucks, and the throwing daggers, which are still pretty weak, but are a clear winner over the arm. An individual throwing dagger deals 6 damage to the demon, but has a fast rate of fire. However, speedrunners will take their time to charge up shots using the alternate fire, throwing a volley of 3 daggers at once, dealing 15 damage each for a total of 45. This is the most effective way to deal damage, and if you time your charged shots well enough, the demon can be beaten just before the end of the 3rd damage cycle. Whilst Crash was researching for his tasks, he uncovered a way to combine the fast fire rate of the individual dagger, but the increased damage output of the charge daggers. By tapping X and then square in a very particular rhythm, you could now throw individual daggers that dealt 15 damage, increasing their damage by 250%. This was found in 2021 and was dubbed as Super Daggers. It was never taken seriously because the input and rhythm were too precise for a human to maintain. However, Lalle did some research and found a human doable method that was almost as fast as the tasks. Super daggers were so powerful that it was almost possible to defeat the demon in a single cycle, and this resulted in a 30-second time save. Oh, and that's not all, because this trick has a cousin with reversed inputs for the club. Aside from bashing down some breakable objects and knockback dashing, the club is used for the other 3 bosses remaining in the run, the Guardians of the Graveyard, Cladall, and Zarok. Super Club, also known as the Poke of Death, was found by Crash and begins with square and quickly pressing X, alternating in a faster and also slightly different rhythm to Super Daggers. Just as before, many thought this would be extremely difficult to perform consistently, but once again, Lalle showed everyone that a human could practice and get consistent with it, but it was seen as a significant step up in difficulty from the Super Daggers. In the span of 1 week, more than 1.5 minutes in time saves had been found, and the 2 largest run-killing levels had become oh so much easier. Even if NoobKiller was still the more technically sound runner, he was away from the game. Surely, his 7.5-year reign at the top would finally come to an end. And just a few days later, it did. The 2340 was beaten by Nazzareno. This run almost never happened. It was just about as sketchy as a run could get. As Naz scaled Cemetery Hill, he got double hit by the boulders and almost fell to his death, which he would have reset on because it was so early in the run. He activated Jaco Ghost really early, while he was still submerged in the ooze, but luckily it was late enough to where the game would place him above the surface so he could access the end trigger. He landed on the mountain in Haunted Ruins, and while making his way back down, almost overshot a jump that would have put him in an area that would have ended the run. The ghost ship out of bounds went terribly. He was supposed to make his way over the barrier in a single jump, but instead landed on a closed trapdoor and then managed to barely get out of bounds to perform the loop. If the trapdoor was open, then he would have fell into the belly of the ship, and making your way back to try and perform the loop again means negotiating those trapdoors. Even things that weren't potentially run-ending had their issues. That tombstone on return to the graveyard, still a major inconvenience even for the best runners. But in the end, this run was still world record. Naz had perfect super daggers for the stained glass demon, saving a huge amount of time. Dragon Gate Skip wasn't first try in, first try out, more like 10th try in, 4th try out. Naz even had to take care of an enemy with his sword to preserve his club for Cladall and Zarok. Speaking of the club, Naz bailed on using Super Club at literally the last minute.
No, I'm not going to do Super Daggers.
He wasn't totally confident in his ability yet. Even a slight offset from the required rhythm would result in time loss or death. And perhaps the scariest part of the run came during the Zarok fight itself. Knowing he was ahead of the world record by a considerable amount, he did all he could to keep good positioning and tried to bait Zarok to lower his shield. Twice during the fight, Naz's life was brought down to a single hit away from ending the run. With no energy vials remaining, he retreated to the healing fountain where thankfully you cannot be damaged whilst inside, and managed to get off a few free hits. In the final moments, Zarok was 2 club hits away from death whilst Naz was a single hit away himself, just as the life fountain ran out. Zarok lowered his shield and Naz went for it.
Oh my god. GG, son of a bitch.
Another half a minute had been slashed off the world record, and Naz was on top of the leaderboard. For 1 whole day. Londanomala was the newest of the any percent runners, only picking up the game after Dragon Gate Skip was found, which makes this world record quite unique. Lond didn't have the same rigor and experience as the other runners. He would completely destroy the stained glass demon with super daggers. That's a 30-second time save. But he never went for the skull key skip, only picking it up after the cutscene ends, costing 5 seconds. Later on in the run, he would miss the half loop in Haunted Ruins, and he would nail the backup by landing on the roof that NoobKiller used to land on. However, Londanomala would then take the long way to get the King's Crown instead of performing the rather simple clip in, which is a decent amount faster. He never even attempted to open the inventory for Cladall Skip. Sure, it was very difficult to get and you need some luck, but it wastes no time if you miss it. Another minor note is Lon's lack of mastery of speed glitching early in the run. On several occasions, mistimed inputs caused Dan to start walking, costing valuable time, which ironically makes this speedrun somewhat canonically accurate with Fortescue's character, lazy and a bit of a klutz. Nevertheless, Londanomala was well versed in all the strategies and skips that really mattered. He wasn't flawless though, as Dragon Gate skips still proved to be difficult. Lond entered Zarok a ways behind Naz, but by using the Super Club to turn Kardok and Zarok into mincemeat, he was able to save enough time back, setting a new world record of 22:57, being the first runner to go under 23 minutes. Just as Nazzareno and Londanomala were on a roll, NoobKiller strikes back with a new world record of his own, a 22:34. What was perhaps even more terrifying was how rusty NoobKiller was. Routine super daggers on the stained glass demon did not go as well as he would have hoped, and he had to resort to not performing Skull Key skip, which he had managed in basically every other run. A routine fight like Guardians of the Graveyard went far longer than normal due to some simple mistimed club hits. And if we take a look at these splits, we can see that despite this janky execution, this run was still significantly faster than a PB he had gotten just days prior. A massive time saver for NoobKiller in this run was the Dragon Gate skip. Naz and Lond had spent a total of 14 tries to get in and out each. Noob on the other hand gets in 4th try and out 1st try, setting a new personal best on that segment. And with his substantial lead out of Gallo's gauntlet, he tore through Kardok and Zarok with the Super Club and regained his place on top. And then NoobKiller lost his world record again. Nazzareno recently secured the world record in all the other main categories: any percent no DGS, 100%, max percent, and even the meme arm percent, where you play through the game using only your arm to damage the enemies.
Ali, this is arm percent. It's not really an autoscroller. It's a torture.
Yeah, true insanity. Anyway, to complete his leaderboard sweep, Nazzareno grinded hard, capitalizing on the sloppy areas that NoobKiller had in his run, and managed to grab the record back with a 22:27. But for how long? Who knew?
What a cursed ED. I'm not going after this until Noob improves it. I don't give a fuck. I got the sweep. Yo, Glenn. I'll have the sweep for like 24 hours, but whatever. Black.
Naz holding the world record for a whole 24 hours? It would have been funny if he lost it faster than that, right? Well, he didn't. I think that Naz really did recognize NoobKiller's skill, and that he could take back the world record basically whenever he wanted. And eventually, that did happen. Just under a month later, NoobKiller would come back almost completely de-rusted and would post up a 22:10 on July 12th. And then a 22 flat just 2 days later. Once again, NoobKiller had outdone himself, and everyone else. This run had a shaky start. The time save from the rare clean coffin clip was lost on another poor Guardians of the Graveyard fight, and Noob was nearly 15 seconds behind the world record after completing the half loop in Enchanted Earth. NoobKiller continued this run, clawing a chunk of time back on Dragon Gate skip. He managed to get in on the 2nd try, and after spending some time to kill the enemies, managed to escape the room on a 1st try knockback dash, just about as good as one could hope for. 2 perfect loops on Haunted Ruins set him a brand new gold split, saving another 3.5 seconds. NoobKiller was just 4.5 seconds behind heading into Zarok, and he nails Soldier Despawn. And for the first time in a world record run, he hits Kardok's skip. Once again, this locks Kardok behind the gate until you close the inventory, and desyncs him from his shield timer. If you manage to beat Kardok before he puts his shield back up, that results in a 15-second time save. NoobKiller poked Kardok as best as he could, but some poor positioning at the end caused some missed hits, and Kardok ran away and raised his shield. NoobKiller had to give that potential 15-second time save back. After dealing with Kardok, Zarok entered the battle, and this happened. 18-second fight. While not perfect, you can't ask for a run ending much luckier than that. The only real weakness this world record had was a slow early game, but the end of the run was as strong as they come. It really did seem true. As long as NoobKiller ran any percent, he would always be able to take the world record back. After losing the world record, Nazzareno wouldn't come back to any percent. Instead, he would return back to the longer categories, particularly 100%, attempting to lower the record there. He would stream semi-regularly, and for about 3 hours at a time. If by the end of a session he didn't have enough time to complete a 100% run, he may throw in a couple of any percent attempts, usually with no success and even coming close to the world record. There was one attempt in particular that went really far though, but that was it. It was just one that went really far. Heading into Gallo's Gauntlet to go for DGS, the best projected time for his run was 21 minutes and 45 seconds, meaning if he tied his best splits for the rest of the run, that would be his final time. But as you know, just tying the best you've ever done, particularly on Dragon Gate Skip, is extremely unlikely. Naz got in 6th try, nothing special, but the final nail in the coffin was on the exit. The enemies were in the way, and Naz tried to kill them quickly with a club, but as they hung around near the walls and avoided damage, they just drained way too much time. After completing the skip, reality set in, as the best possible time began to tick away before Naz had even collected the star rune.
It's over. I cannot make it. Stupid.
After that, the best possible time was 22 minutes and 6 seconds. Naz pressed on though, as setting a new personal best was still on the table. Every mistake now was going to add up and make it that much more difficult. And unfortunately, there were 2 mistakes on the next level. He turned back too early when trying to collect the crown, wasting a lot of time on the screen transitions, and then he tried to select the crown whilst too far from the throne.
Losing time, it's over, it's over, it's over. All my time saved now is in Zarok's Lair. I think I can get golds with Cladall like RNG and Super Club, but I cannot do Super Club properly, so I cannot rely on that.
It was true. Naz couldn't quite do Super Club properly, and he had not used it in his 2 previous record runs. His consistency was not like Lalle's or NoobKiller's. Naz wasn't even sure if he could do the Ghost Ship loop properly, since he hadn't had an any percent run this deep in a long time. This time, Naz would intentionally jump onto a closed trapdoor as a safe strategy, and then hits the loop, but playing safe would end up costing him a 1.5 seconds. Naz would enter Zarok's Lair with the best possible time of 22:14.99. As long as he played within 12 seconds of his best ever Zarok split, he would set a new personal best. In the interest of not losing more time, he hastily goes for Soldier despawn, and hits it. All he had to do now was mentally prepare himself over the next 1.5 minutes for Cladall and Zarok. As Naz waited for the battle to end, he began to worry a little as his warriors were not winning the battle convincingly. There is randomness with how fast each warrior attacks, and this battle was going poorly. The battle suddenly became a 2-on-2, and Naz decided to go pick up the good lightning to heal his warriors. However, they ended up getting the win without any help. Even though the battle was slightly slower, Naz ended up saving time on average, because at the end, he only had to watch 2 of his soldiers turn into energy vials.
Cladall skip? Oh no.
For the first time ever on a run this good, Naz had hit Cladall skip. If he could save 15 seconds here and then have a godlike Zarok fight, world record might be possible. Not even close. The Super Club was just not there, and those precious 15 seconds were gone. Naz finished the fight with some more Super Club, a little better than before, but he knew it. That was his one chance to possibly world record, but he would try to finish the run strong and set a new PB.
I'm not gonna make it. It's impossible, man. very sassy. I need the super club, but like super club with Zarok is impossible. I have 20 seconds at most. Impossible. That was a bad run.
I want to pause right here to show you how dire yet incredible this situation is. Nazzareno has had basically no faith in this run world recording since Dragon Gate skip, and the numbers showed it. But now, the timer tells a different story. If he is able to finish the fight in the next 6 seconds, he will set a new world record, even though his best ever final split here results in a 22-14. That's not all though, because Naz had spent a considerable amount of his club during Dragon Gate skip, and spent some more with some accidental ground smashes on Cladall. He was left with only 3% remaining, and Zarok still had 220 health. But Naz wasn't looking at any of these things. How could he? Because his focus was entirely on the fight.
World fucking record!
Tonight, I am finally defeated.
Oddio!
Yet
Mi
if
si
I
sono
am to
sciolte le
fail,
gambe.
then all shall perish.
C'ho le
You are
ginocchia.
doomed, Fortescue. You will never
C'ho le
leave
ginocchia
this
burrate.
domain.
Extra!
With an almighty new best segment by 18 seconds, Naz had taken the world record for a third time from NoobKiller, with the first ever sub 22 minute run. Not only did Naz get phenomenal luck on the Zarok fight, he had also executed the Super Club the best he had ever done. During the final cutscenes, Naz does still say this about the run.
But yeah, now we have a run that is a world record, but it sucks until the very end. It's very improvable. There is still time saving DGS in Gallus Gauntlet, and everywhere else it's just easy peasy time save.
It may have been true that Nazzareno's early game was weak, at least by his standards, but the truth was that the final split for this run was nearly unbeatable unless you successfully pulled off Cladall skip. The Zarok luck alone was absolutely insane. Even though Naz's Super Club was sketchier than other top runners, Zarok had spent an abnormally long time in his vulnerable state. The largest blemish on this run, and as a matter of fact almost all runs by all top runners, was Dragon Gate skip. Even with the knockback dash in and out, it was extremely unlikely to get both of these maneuvers quickly, especially on the exit where there are 4 enemies which can get in the way. They can be extremely annoying, leaving openings and then closing them before you even have time to react. The simple fact was that getting a perfect Dragon Gate skip like this was so unbelievably unlikely. On top of all the other difficult and unlikely things in the run, a perfect any % run of MediEvil might never happen. That is, until NoobKiller found out that you could skip Dragon Gate skip. One of the old ideas for Dragon Gate skip was to somehow clip into this gate and collect the star rune, which to this day still seems impossible. But what if we could get a star rune from somewhere else, like a different level? Return to the Graveyard has this star rune gate which we can skip, and the star rune is very close by, just above the building. Unfortunately, this doesn't work. Runes are a little different from the other collectibles in the game. Every rune within a level is intended to be used in order to complete that stage. It is not within the game's programming to keep track of unused runes. And so, if you do manage to complete a level without using one, it is removed from the inventory upon level exit. 4 months prior, on the same day Jacobo found Jaco Ghost, he also broke the game doing something else. On the main map screen, you were given 2 prompts, enter level and save game. On a level you've already beaten, there is an additional check asking you if you want to replay the level. By opening the save menu and replay level menu in that order in quick succession, and then saying yes to replay the level begins to load whilst restoring controls back to the save option, and during this load into Dan's crypt, Jacobo hits yes on save game. Now, this is where things get weird. When you load into the level, the game is still reading the memory card, and then it asks you which file you want to save over. If you are wondering, you are absolutely not supposed to be able to access the save menu whilst inside a level like this. For each menu transition, you get a few frames where you can move inside the level. Nothing came of Jacobo's research at first, as the hype around Jaco Ghost, Super Club, and Super Daggers quickly overshadowed it. After Nazzareno got the world record, NoobKiller began to test this oddity within Haunted Ruins, seeing if he could break the unique checkpoint system within the level. Having painstakingly played through more than half the level and collecting the green rune, he saved the game instead of going back and forth between save options. After a quit out to the main menu and loading up the save file, he ended up being sent to the main map and everything was normal. Except when he entered a level and checked his inventory, the green rune he collected was right there. This glitch called rune smuggling was the answer for the ever so unreliable Dragon Gate skip. Everything worked out perfectly. The exact rune you needed in Gallows Gauntlet is the star rune, and the fastest rune that you can pick up in the game, in Dan's crypt, is also a star rune. It is also so early in the level that you barely have to play with the annoying pausing. The obvious downside was the extra map movement and quitting out to load up the save file. I'm gonna give it to you straight. Rune smuggling is slower than a perfect Dragon Gate skip. However, the keyword there is perfect. NoobKiller's best Dragon Gate skip is 14 seconds faster than a rune smuggle, a trick which is free in comparison. 99% of the time, rune smuggling would result in a time save rather than a time loss. There were a few other minor things added into the run as well, the first being a quality of life update to the rules. The repetitive nature of speed glitching was causing hand problems for some runners. To save people from having medical expenses later, it was decided by the community that turbo controllers or third-party settings on emulator to perform speed glitch would be allowed. There was a small text box skip also discovered by NoobKiller. If you timed a pause correctly after the battle with the Guardians of the Graveyard, you could save 3 seconds. And finally, the most risky discovery of all was found by Crash, who was just finishing up his brand new tool-assisted speedrun. Upon level exit, you will notice there is a dark circle that closes around the center of the screen and then the level deloads. This also happens when you pause and quit. It's like there is a 3-second countdown before the game begins to load whatever it needs to load. Crash discovered that if you quit out, initiating the closing circle, and then hit a level exit, the load point gets overwritten with the level exit, but the countdown circle doesn't reset, and a few frames could be saved. However, if you mistimed this, you would end up quitting out to the main menu, completely ruining your own run. A few frames of time save was not worth the risk, right? Well, on a couple of key levels, the exit works a little differently. Hilltop Mausoleum ends when you collect the Skull Key, and Haunted Ruins ends after you jump on the catapult. On these two levels, the pause and quit trick is a lot easier and saves more time, a couple of seconds each. On the same day as Rune Smuggling's discovery, August 24th, 2022, along with all the other small changes, NoobKiller would take back the world record again with a final time of 21 minutes and 40 seconds. Completing a MediEvil any % run has never been easy, not even in the eyes of the people who played it most. Even from the very beginning, there had been half a dozen difficult run-ending tricks. As the speedrun became more developed, more and more tricks began to be implemented in the endeavour to save time, and the run had reached peak difficulty in 2020 when the original Dragon Gate skip was found. Since then, more discoveries improved speedrunners' chances for hitting crucial tricks, and with consistency skyrocketing, more attention to even basic movement and platforming was also emphasized, allowing runners to go faster than ever before. Don't get me wrong, an any % run is still difficult, but with the advent of tricks like Jaco Ghost and Rune Smuggling, the run was now easier than ever. With that, NoobKillerRoof would go on one final tear on any %. the category he had made his own. As of the recording of this sentence, since first taking the record on December 2nd, 2014, NoobKillerRoof has held the MediEvil any% world record for 3,068 out of the last 3,125 days, an extended period of dominance that is rarely seen. NoobKiller may have been the first and only person thus far to break into the sub 21, but is there anything left for MediEvil any%? Well, let's talk about some of those options. There are 3 places where a human could feasibly gain time on NoobKiller's 2058. The easiest and smallest of these time saves would be just getting on this troublesome tombstone, which seems to be the bane of every MediEvil runner's existence. The second place would be to stop using the rune smuggle route and go back to doing traditional Dragon Gate skip. With good luck on the enemy positioning and getting in and out first try, 15 or more seconds could be saved. The third spot would be on the final split. NoobKiller did not get Cardok skip in the world record. Even something as innocuous as that is still missing from the world record run. A better soldier fight could also save a few seconds, although this is pure RNG, and on the bell curve of possible fights, NoobKiller's is still a little above average. And finally, the Zarok fight. NoobKiller did manage another 18-second fight in the world record. However, this is still shy of his best ever, which was 13 seconds. With all of these things, a time in the 21x range is possible, and we can see that this is exactly what the sum of NoobKiller's best segments add up to. But is there anything else? Well, we can look at the completed any% task by Crash that was published in early 2022. There are a few pretty ridiculous strats that save 5 seconds here and 5 seconds there, but all of these things are once again too precise and would result in a significant time loss if missed. The simplest and biggest time save seems to be this very simple looking jump over the yellow rune gap in Crystal Caves. Compared to the level loop, this route would save about 10 seconds. Despite how simple it seems, no one has ever been able to pull it off in real time. A perfect angle and perfect camera positioning seem to be necessary for it to work, which is beyond human control. The best hope in further lowering the potential time seems to be in the ideas of the undiscovered. There are currently 6 level loops in the route, and only 2 of them are half loops. If we can figure out the requirements to turn a full loop into a half loop, then 10 to 12 seconds each could be saved on the remaining 4. As you've seen, there are so many wacky clips that have featured in the run throughout the years, but one level that could use a clip is Hilltop Mausoleum. If it were possible to clip just a few pixels into this gate, you could hit the trigger which will cause it to open. Something like this would be a massive 45-second time save. NoobKiller also found another glitch a long time ago called void launching. By getting stuck between some geometry and the solid void that surrounds the level, you can get ejected at huge speed, making a journey across a level nearly instantly. Crash investigated this but couldn't find a single use for it in any task format because the ejection angle always resulted in travelling backwards through the level. and this remains as the only known spot in the game where a void launch is possible. There is one final thing I'd like to add, and that is about soldier despawn. I mentioned earlier that this glitch is only possible on emulator. That wasn't entirely true. It only works on some emulators, ones that are not exactly closest to modeling the PlayStation 1. Most, if not all runners emulate using EPSXE version 2.0.0, which is not even the most up-to-date version of EPSXE. On more accurate emulators, the game just crashes exactly like it does on console. And even this isn't the full truth, because as it turns out, soldier despawn is possible on a real PlayStation console. Black Mentho was doing some testing on DuckStation, a more accurate emulator, and did find a way to progress to the Cardok fight with what seems to be a frame-perfect inventory open. But even this wasn't enough, as it would not prevent the game from crashing on BizHawk, one of the most accurate emulators today for creating tool-assisted speedruns on the PS1. Crash, however, did find a method to perform soldier despawn that almost certainly works on console. On emulator runs, you must spawn in the final 4 soldiers just as the battle ends, and then they despawn when Cardok is loaded in, leaving behind their shadows and collision boxes. Console soldier despawn bypasses that all completely by never spawning the final 4 soldiers. Remember, the soldiers will spawn in if at any point the camera passes too far into the northern region. This means when the battle ends, you have to perform some frame-perfect inventory opens akin to performing Cardok skip. And then you have to do this same process again after the Cardok battle for Zarok, because the camera gets placed in the northern region. This causes Zarok to get stuck behind the gate, losing time back to emulator runs, and getting him to break free requires more RNG manipulation and luck, which you need to do from a safe distance. Finally, just as the final cutscene plays showing Dan running away, yup, you guessed it, the game can crash here as well, and that is even with good camera positioning. For all intents and purposes, console soldier despawn is a 1 in a million trick requiring extreme execution and luck to get it to work. The history of MediEvil Any% is not yet complete. Even during the production of this video, more and more tricks, glitches, and techniques are being brought to light, from faster methods to performing Dragon Gate skip, to save corruption and possibly arbitrary code execution could bring the fastest time to below 5 minutes. The big question is though, who will be the next person to take the world record from NoobKiller? Nazzareno? Londanomala? Jacobo? Or maybe you? Thanks for watching.